about open. Thank you. That's okay. That's okay. So open in what sense? And there's different definitions of that too, not surprisingly. It might mean freely accessible. It might mean that people can use it and reuse, say, data or software or even findings or publications. They can share them. They can modify what's been provided. Depends on the context, whether all those things are permitted. Usually the main thing you have to do is just attribute it, say that it came from so-and-so, and because of the kinds of licensing or copyright or whatever that's attached to it, this allows science to accumulate. It allows it to build over time. Now, an additional part of the openness has to do with not just making this available to your colleagues for reuse within science, but making it available more widely. And so particularly to publics outside of, say, the scientific circle. There's other notions that people cite in terms of the standards that are associated with open science. And this has to do, for example, with what are called the FAIR standards. So FAIR is an acronym, I'm sure many of you know this: findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. And in particular, it's not good enough just to put stuff up if it can't actually be accessed, if it actually can't be understood or made to communicate through interoperability for the purposes of the new research. So then there's the big question, and this is the one we're going to continue to discuss, but I wanted to take an opening bid on the many and diverse reasons people give for why openness is good for research, or why is open science good for research. People make claims like it allows us to avoid duplication. It allows validation because methods are made open. It allows researchers to make their methods, their assumptions, their standards much more transparent, which in turn supports things like validation. It leads to more collaboration and in turn perhaps to more innovation. All of these, of course, require empirical evidence in any particular case, but these are the general kinds of goals people promote. It gives outputs and research more generally more visibility. And in turn, it leads to increased use and reuse of scientific findings or scientific data or theories or whatever else. And yet in turn, this is the kind of lever a lot of us who are involved in senior administration use, it allows more citations. It's more likely to result in more citations and perhaps more impact of research. There's also practical things like being forced to make your data open, perhaps gives it more security because it's in more than one place. It gives it more sustainability because it's not just on you and your lab or your research group to maintain the data. I think some of the more interesting things has to do with the fact that making it open requires you to be reflexive about your data and how they were produced. But maybe most importantly, in some sense, at least for my interests also, is this idea that as researchers, we have certain responsibilities to our participants, if we're doing, say, human subjects research of various types, or more generally to publics, and particularly where we're working in publicly funded universities or publicly funded grants. That's just a range of things, but we're going to dig down into the details with this great panel. The bottom line, I think, is one size never fits all. One model of open science is not going to work if it's just transported whole hog into a different domain. And so my own research, among the things I've looked at in the past are principles for data sharing that became very popular and institutionalized in the 1990s. They came out of a very particular background in projects involving genetic sequence information and worked to a certain extent. But they also didn't work when they tried to become global and they went to contexts such as Germany or Japan, which had very different rules around sharing data that was produced under certain conditions and therefore had commercial in confidence or IP information attached. They also are not that useful when you pick them up and it's not genetic sequence that you're sharing, because sort of the assumptions really were associated with certain kinds of information, cataloged in certain ways, curated in certain ways, and so on. And that could be used for certain sorts of things. So when we blow up any proposal made in a specific domain and try and make it generalizable, it may not be fit to purpose. And that's part of what, when open science is used in a very generic way, a lot of people bristle. So we're going to try and dig down into using it in a much less generic way and see where we get. And so I want to introduce my colleagues from the right. I'll start with Cameron Nealon here. You can tell which one Cameron is. He's the professor of research communications at the Center for Culture and Technology at Curtin University in Perth, Australia. So one of my colleagues down under. Cameron from 2012-2015 was the advocacy director at the Public Library of Science. And he has a long history of promoting open science and appropriate use of data, particularly to understand processes in publication and other practices that are common in contemporary university settings. So related to things like representation and diversity. To his right, we have Sally Wyatt. Sally is an STS scholar who's currently professor of digital cultures and also, for her sins, associate dean for research at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht in the Netherlands. Sally is well recognized in STS and beyond, so science and technology studies, for her work on technology and inequalities, for her attention to those who don't want to use technology or use it and stop using it. A very important topic, I think, for us tonight. And also particularly circulation of data and practices associated with that, including genetic data. To her right, we have Carol Goebel. Carol is professor of computer science at the University of Manchester. Carol's widely recognized for her various and numerous efforts to do research on and build infrastructures to support scientists who do data-intensive science, particularly in the life sciences. These include the European Open Facts Project, which sought to enable better, cheaper, and faster drug discovery, and the open source software tool Apache Taverna for research workflows, which was part of the larger MyGrid consortium, which sought to use a suite of tools designed to help e-scientists get on with their science. And I love this slogan, e-scientists to get on with their science and to get on with other scientists. So to foster collaboration. Finally, but certainly not least, Helen Longenau down the end has been a central contributor to debates in feminist and social epistemology and the philosophy of science. She's a Clarence Irving Lewis Professor of Philosophy at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, and has written extensively on philosophical issues such as contextual empiricism and the practices associated with science as social knowledge. She's been a huge influence on a number of us in the room here tonight. So I'm going to start with the softball question about your experiences with open science and how they've shaped your views. And so this is kind of a request for a bit of a biographical reflection and to situate yourself in the context of open science. So Cameron, over to you.
Thank you. As Australian, I will also follow Rachel in acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people as traditional custodians of the land that Curtin University sits on. Acknowledge their elders, past, present, and future, and their continuing connection and care for that unceded land. And I might come back to that at the end of these remarks as well. So I started my life as a chemist, biochemist, and have gone off track somewhat to have ended up in a cultural studies research centre via advocacy. And in the middle of that, which is probably where I went completely off the rails, I was doing work on directed evolution. So this is the idea that we could take gene sequences, randomize them in some way, make these huge libraries of variants, turn those into proteins and then select things. So it was the early form of protein engineering. And I was deeply frustrated. My experiments weren't working. And I was looking at all these other experiments out there that other people were doing, which apparently were all working. And I really, for a while, couldn't understand why everyone else was doing so well, same techniques, same approaches. They were, in the end, getting Nobel Prizes for it, in the case of Francis Arnold. But my stuff wasn't working. And I realized, of course, part of this was because they weren't reporting on those experiments. So this was around 2004, 2005. And there was also this other exciting thing happening at the moment. I don't know, you may have come across it called the web. And this was a time before everyone in a university had email, probably just a few holdouts in the early 2000s. But we had this thing on the web and we could put things online. And I was working with Jeremy Frey at the University of Southampton at the time. We were working on a lab notebook system. And the funny part of this story is that we were working on this lab notebook system and trying to get some stuff up and make it work. We kept hitting the the technical access system for the university just kept breaking, couldn't log in. And I got fed up with it. I said, well, why don't we just get rid of the login? We'll just put the lab notebook up online. I thought, actually, that's a bit radical. It didn't occur to me until years after. I probably should have asked the tech transfer office. But so we did this thing up. And again, being an academic, my immediate thought process was, well, it's kind of web and science, web 2.0, science 2.0. Maybe that's a Nature paper. And 5 minutes search, discovered other people were doing it. And it got me into this rabbit hole of really radical open science, this notion of open notebook science that Jean-Claude Bradley, amongst others, were championing. And we were convinced this was going to change the world. So again, this was 15 years ago. I was younger then. And you become the kind of radical who becomes convinced this is the only way to make it work. It did have some really good effects. It made me, I was lazy, a terrible note keeper. You can see I'm still a terrible note keeper. Colin's doing much better. And so the process of reflecting that someone might look at this was a powerful way of me improving my record keeping. It worked with students who were also not always as great at keeping records as one might like. It led to collaborations. It led to us discovering people who could do the kinds of analysis that we couldn't do and figuring things out and being able to do things. But at the same time, it led me, as being this radical, into that kind of narrow space, an ideological space where you become convinced that this was the right way to do things, that everyone who was refusing to do it was evil and wrong, and that there were very specific markers. And I will not talk about licensing, I promise. But those kinds of arguments that lead you to a very specific, narrow way of thinking about doing things. And actually it was social media where, and there was a group of us, right? And they looked a lot like me. Many of you, 20-something white young men doing science in a technological space, particular kind of community. And then we bumped into the librarians. And this included a bunch of librarians who were not taking any of our shit. And so we learned to listen to some other perspectives along the way. And so the long story short of is open science good for science? Is there are many practices that can improve our science. We can do better at many different things. But that one size does not fit all, that you got to look at the context, you got to understand what you're trying to achieve. Openness is not an end in itself. And that narrowly defining the way to do it is not a way forward. And understanding where the context comes from. So I come back to that Indigenous recognition. It's a form of words, it's a ritual. But it at least starts to embed in the story we're telling about what we're doing when we have events and have create knowledge, that we're respecting and reflecting on knowledge from other places and other forms, including knowledge that shouldn't be shared, that should possibly not be open. So I think, my experience has actually been largely positive. It's done, it's helped me do things better. But at the same time, it's been a long learning journey from that sort of radical activist who was convinced that we needed to burn everything down and I knew exactly where to light the fire, to learning that there are more things on heaven and earth that we need to understand and dig into deeper to do this kind of well, and to do science and research and scholarship well.
Fabulous. Helen, can I ask you to go next? Can you push the green button, the red button to become a green button? Thank you.
I'm now green button. So I'm a philosopher. I'm not a research scientist. And my relation to open science, I suppose, has to start way back at the beginning for me. In 1990, I published a book called Science as Social Knowledge. And this was directed at certain conceptions of scientific knowledge that were then current among my colleagues in the philosophy of science, views that took their inspiration from folks like Hempel, certain cartoons of Carnap, Popper, etc. And the idea that I was challenging in that book was the idea that science has a set of methods that entitle us to consider it free of social values, and that entitle it to call itself free of social values, and hence a neutral source of knowledge for the rest of us to rely on. And I argued that the nature of inference in the sciences was such that there was always a gap between data and theories, et cetera, et cetera. So that vision did not hold up to scrutiny. And I proposed, so the ideal of objectivity was problematic, which it was also coming under pressure from critics from environmental movements, from feminists, from anti-racists, who saw the ways in which the sciences had been abused, you might say, to support racist practices, racist ideologies, and so forth, from the, well, for a very long time. So there were two things coming together. I didn't want to reject objectivity, but I did want to rethink it. And I understood, or I proposed, that the solution to the problem of the gap between data, evidence, and theories and models was to understand scientific knowledge as a product of critical interaction among researchers, which made knowledge social, not the product of an individual mind devoting itself to the collection and analysis of data and coming up with interpretations of that data, but made knowledge itself an outcome of critical social interactions. And one of the necessities for critical social interaction was the availability of multiple perspectives that could provide such criticism. In my first book, I focused more narrowly on the ways in which feminist biologists had criticized some of the dominant views in biology, and that criticism was, number one, changed biology in various ways, not fully, not completely, but in certain local ways. See, where was I going? Yeah, that was my my primary kind of example in that book. I was also arguing that there were, well, in service of that argument, I showed how there were different conceptions of brain development, for example, that underlay our conceptions of gender, so on and so forth. The basic idea, though, was that science is the outcome of critical interaction. And for critical interaction, you need diverse perspectives in the research community who can provide, engage in criticism. This seems to this sounds like a philosophical justification for open science, where open science is understood as the openness of the, what we might call, knowledge productive community to alternative points of view. It's been understood, I think, in many in many cases, the way in which this gets operationalized is to think about focusing on demographic diversity. Demographic diversity is not necessarily a carrier of perspectival or cognitive diversity. So I think that's something we need to think about when we're thinking about open science. Yeah, so that's, I had a follow-up book, but I think I'll reserve my comments about that till later when they become more relevant to the question of open science. But that's my relation to open science. I think, you know, if I think about it from my 1990 self, that's terrific. This is just what we're calling for.
Yep.
The devils are in the details is much more complicated when you get on the ground.
Great, thank you. Sally, over to you. Can you say a bit about your experiences and how they've shaped your views on open science?
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you all for spending your Friday afternoon here. So yeah, I'm a social scientist. Field of science and technology studies, as Rachel already mentioned, but if pressed at a party, I would say I'm a sociologist because that's what people might recognize, though I've never done a sociology course in my life, but okay. But as a social scientist, broadly defined, for me, data includes things like, you know, transcripts of interviews, transcripts from focus groups, documentary sources that could be, you know, media reports or annual reports from companies or policy documents or things like that. That's kind of what our kind of data or my kind of data looks like. And in a cupboard in my house, I literally have a shoebox with 3¼ or 3½ inch floppy disks where my data now is, and I can no longer access it. With probably some effort, I could go and find somebody at the University of Manchester who might be able to read this for me, but as a method of storing data and making it open to my future self, it didn't work out quite so well. But I have kept this shoebox and I carry it with me when I move house and thinking, well, who knows, I might need this sometime. Unlikely, but never mind. So that was my kind of self back in, I don't know, when we still had 3½ inch floppy disks. But then about 10, 12 years ago, I did a project about selling genetic tests online, and that's a whole different story. But I was doing it together with actually somebody from the University of Exeter, Susan Kelly, and a postdoc from Australia, Anna Harris, who's now a colleague in Maastricht. And we were jointly kind of working on this, and we were also collecting these kinds of data and also kind of screenshots from the various genetic testing companies and things like that. We thought, oh, we need a way to share this. So we used Dropbox. Sorry, Carol. You drop. Oh, okay. Well, my university, if there's anybody from my university online listening, we're not supposed to do that because it's not secure. It's a commercial company, but it kind of worked for us. So I think, I mean, the kind of moral of these sort of stories is technology changes. So having somebody else look after your data so you could access it at some future point and they worry about the kind of technological capabilities and compatibilities and future-proofing it for you, I think is a really good thing. But I suppose the other thing I learned from all of this is that yeah, it is. I think we have a responsibility as researchers to kind of keep our data in case anyone ever asks us about how did you reach these conclusions. And I don't get into the replication debate. I don't think that makes much sense in terms of the kind of work that I do. But I think, yeah, we do have a responsibility to kind of take care of our data, also to the people who provided that data to us. So I think this whole thing about open science and data management and other ways that we kind of talk about this, I think is also extremely useful for social science and humanities scholars who maybe have different kinds of data. And a couple of years after the project with Susan and Anna, I actually took part in an EU project about open access to research data. And that's what it was called. And, you know, we always said right at the beginning and at the end, this is a great thing. But the problem is, you know, all of those words are deeply problematic. Open, access, research, and data. You know, and we've already kind of touched on this, whether you're a chemist or a philosopher or a social scientist, you have very, very different notions of data and how to look after it and how to share it with other people. So yes, to kind of echo what Helen just said and Rachel also in the introduction, that yeah, the devil really is in the detail, and just saying open access is good. Yeah, okay, and now what?
And last but not least, Carol.
So thank you. And I'm sorry, my voice isn't very good. So So I don't like to break the news to you, but the media isn't stable on those floppies. You might as well just use them as coasters. You're never going to get the data. That data's gone.
I have a lot of coasters
So
anyone's
you
got
could
to
just use them as coasters. That's what I do. I'm a computer scientist, and I'm a sort of career computer science professor. I started off doing knowledge sharing, semantic technologies, computational pipeline infrastructure, because I wanted to be able to make people be able to describe their data in machine processable ways, and also to be able to process it. So to really accelerate science by automated processing and accelerate science by sharing their data. I became a infrastructure person. So it was very interesting hearing my piece there, because that's a 15-year-old CV.
There you go.
Right.
You need to update your online presence.
I think the university hasn't put up my latest CV.
There you go.
Anyway, so one of the things I did was co-found the Software Sustainability Institute in the UK, which particularly looks at how to use sustained software that comes out of research in order for other researchers to be able to use it in future. But also that was fundamental in establishing the notion of research software engineers and the professionalization of people who actually can support software alongside data stewards, the people who can support data stewardship, and to look at how in the total management of data and software in the open science world that we have communities that aren't just researchers, we have an entire enterprise, and universities are getting on board on that. The second thing I do is I build and work with many others in developing and supporting infrastructure, digital research infrastructure for disciplines, particularly the biology and biodiversity. And in that sense, I'm the head of Elixir UK. Elixir is the research infrastructure, European research infrastructure for life science data. It has 23 countries, and each country has multiple organizations. Elixir UK has 24 organizations in it, including the University of Exeter, actually. And what we do is we work together to sustain the hundreds of data sets and data repositories, tools, infrastructure, computational pipelining environments, registries, abilities to be able to share pipelines, to be able to share software, to be able to share and develop standards, to be able to train stewards, and to be able to understand how we share knowledge around life science data and its software and development. And that we work together in order to be able to bring all of these across Europe, and also in partnership with Australia and the USA, so that we can create the infrastructure so you can do open science. And that has open science at its heart. Because one of the things about open science is, well, you're taught to do things open. How? How do you do that? Where do you put the data? How do I get access to the computational processing in order to be able to make my data more valuable? And has somebody else already done that pipeline? And can I reuse it? So I'm already reusing other people's intellectual knowledge and skill sets. But if I'm doing that, how do I make sure they get credit? How do they going to make sure that they get the credit that they deserve? So we spend a lot of time looking at software citation, data citation, credit models. And it also depends upon high labor in quality. So you can't really reuse somebody else's data unless it's very well described. Otherwise, you can find it, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can use it. And there's a lot of hidden labor in open science around actually the quality, doing good quality data collection, and having the time and the knowledge to be able to do that, as well as the infrastructure and tools. And that has to be done at all points in the life cycle of the data, from the PI in Exeter, who's just got a grant, right the way through to the folks who are managing at an international level the sequence databases of the world. All along that pipeline, all along that journey, that data, there has to be people who are given the time to be able to make that quality. And we still got big gaps. So we've got a lot of people who are looking after archives, but the source in the universities or in the research performing organizations, often there's missing opportunities, and there isn't quite got the infrastructure or the know-how available yet. So then the last piece of work that I do is in policy in order to be able to drive that. I should also incidentally say that one of the techniques we also develop in Elixir is technologies in order to be able to move information around. And I don't mean data or software, I mean digital objects. So the kind of open science movement is moved to the notion of all things are valuable, not just data, but software, standard operating procedures, all sorts of things. And these are packaged together. So rarely are you just working with the data. You need the data and the methods that we use to create it at the same time. And so we need to be able to start packaging these things together with all the richness of what context did they come from? I think what Cameron and others were saying, context is very important. And to make that machine kind of understandable, to be able to move it around an increasingly sophisticated ecosystem of infrastructure we're using in our research, right from sort of off the instruments to actually in the scholarly communication, citation literature. And actually it's Cameron's fault that this started because we have developed a research object framework, which came from a polemic he wrote, which is basically said, I'm just so beat fed up with having to be able to package stuff together. And so we took that and we've done that. And that's now becoming a European standard. So thanks, Cameron, for your sweariness on the web. Somebody listened. And because you were open. There you go.
There you go. The next topic I want to introduce is, even if we agree that open science is a good thing and so on, what are the kinds of opportunities that you think it has provided us, in any sense of provided us, that have been really unexploited or that really warrant a lot more attention? So I wanted to start with Helen, because I think it picks up really nicely on your own description of your work, and particularly some thoughts about fostering more epistemic diversity and roles of people in the global South or otherwise who are epistemically underrepresented.
Right. Well,
Green, thank you.
well, I think there are both problems and perils here. Promise and possibilities and opportunities and perils associated with those promises. So opening up access to the extent that access has been opened, and this is of course a problematic issue, but to the extent that access has been opened, that does enable communities of researchers who have been excluded from the practice of science to the materials and ideas which enable them in turn to collaborate, cooperate among themselves, and also to contribute to the global store of knowledge. There, of course, are well-known difficulties with the expropriative attitude of Northern researchers to workers in the South, where there is a great store of biological diversity that looks really promising for all kinds of purposes. And so there is a great deal of irresponsible extraction for commercial purposes of local knowledge in local communities. So I think that that's one of the perils of trying to incorporate researchers from previously marginalized communities, is just to take their knowledge and to incorporate it, take their data, put it into a format that makes sense for us, and then reuse it for our own commercial or even sort of self-beneficial purposes. But it's nevertheless a form of extraction. And so I think there needs to be a way to think about the relationship, potential relationship, or I said, put that in the plural, potential relationships among researchers from the more wealthy industrialized contexts, and both researchers, I'll just start with researchers from marginalized contexts, so that the privileged researchers are not simply taking the data and using it themselves. So that's one issue. But I also think that we were hearing about this in our workshop this afternoon, that it's important to devise ways of incorporating the research voices and local voices from marginalized communities by learning how to translate back and forth in order to understand and represent those from marginalized communities as co-producers of knowledge, which means that the outcome of those collaborations may not look like what we take to be knowledge in our sort of conventional Western university context. And I think that's I think a challenge, namely, how do you preserve the knowledge forms from communities that have been ignored and maybe or neglected, but maybe saved from the relations with the industrialized world. How does one preserve those knowledge forms and also facilitate access, communication, and so forth? I think this is a genuine problem. There's an opportunity to enrich our understanding of the world by appreciating the perspectives of those who have been marginalized, whether in our own worlds or in the larger world, but at the same time that carries the dangers of exploitation and expropriation that I think is really important to pay attention to. I'm going to stop for a minute.
Okay. Cameron, I wondered if you might be willing, I'm moving over because I've been told that I'm well out of the picture, so I'm not a disembodied voice, but to talk a bit about potential opportunities that are present in an open science to foster more interdisciplinarity, that kind of diversity, right?
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity
Keep going.
before us to get in shot. There's a huge opportunity that arises out of the fact there's been this significant investment. I think we've been critical, but also, actually there's this huge resource of data that has been invested and made available. There's this huge resource of open access content. More than half the world's scholarly production, formal scholarly production, as seen in some of the databases, is actually readable. That's actually it's a very huge shift over the last 10 years. And what we see, and what we have seen in our work, in fact, is that open access content is read by more people in more different places. And there's evidence that it's also more available to different disciplines. So we have, I think, before us the opportunity to actually take advantage of some of the work that's been done over the last 15 years and some of the resources that have been built up as a result of that. And I do think we also have the opportunity to move on. Helen made the point, this is really about epistemic diversity. How do you bring really different perspectives? We use heuristics of demographics, but that's not the thing that we're necessarily focused on, from at least from an instrumental perspective. So what does it mean to build institutions that look like that, that value that? Many of our institutions have strategic plans in which we have 3 things we're supposed to be doing. My institution has people, planet, and partnerships. A university not far from here has beacons, and I actually have no idea what they are, but I'm sure one of them is climate, one of them, there'll be climate sustainability, energy, aging, and 1 or 2 of the other things that everyone else does as well. That's not diversity. So what does it mean to reimagine our institutions? What does the leadership look like? Is leadership in the model of that's trying to homogenize everything to make it manageable, make it countable, make it auditable? What we need to set up the kinds of institutions that will do that work of integrating different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of perspective, and valuing those diversity of contributions. And I think interdisciplinarity is at the core of that. I know all of us who work in interdisciplinary spaces still frustrated constantly about the challenges of explaining why it is we do what we do and whether it's research, who should fund it, goes back to the infrastructure question. But the opportunities before us are really profound. We have this massive corpus of text, this massive resource of data, and the methods and the computing and the software that underpins it. And we have the tools to bring it together. But we don't necessarily have the kinds of leadership and the kinds of institutions that encourage us to do that. I think that's where I would look to next.
Sally, I know one thing that you've been interested in is ways in which universities contribute to the local, contribute to publics in various ways. How can open science help us with that? Now, this may be in your ADR hat or some other hat, but yes.
Yeah, I'll work up to that. I wanted also to pick up on a couple of things that both
Great.
Helen and Cameron have already said, also about, yeah, and we haven't talked much about it in the workshop in the last couple of days, but many of you weren't there, so it doesn't matter. But I think it is an important part of the puzzle about open access publishing. And, you know, and there's a lot of pressure to publish open access, and it's a good thing. It makes it things free to read for anybody who wants to read them. And as Cameron has just said, there's lots of evidence to show that that kind of works, that if things are open access and free to read, people will read them and they'll cite them, and that's kind of good in obvious sorts of ways. But I mean, to pick up on something that Helen was just saying, maybe free to read, but it sure isn't free to publish in a lot of the open access models that are currently being promoted by the big commercial publishers and also by the university presses as well. So that, and then it's a question, yeah, who gets to publish? What voices are being heard? Because, when you've got article processing charges or open access for a monograph, it could be 2,000-3,000 euros for an article, 15,000 euros for a monograph. That's a lot of money, and it's a lot of money for philosophers who tend not to be so rich in universities. It's a lot of money for people in the global south. So it means that, the knowledge being produced by those people doesn't necessarily kind of reach, they don't get to publish. It doesn't reach kind of the audiences they want to reach. And I think that's a real problem, because as we've been saying, I mean, the technology is amazing. It makes it possible to kind of share everything really freely. That was the big hope of the web when it was first started. But nonetheless, various actors have managed to find ways to commodify, commercialize, make money using the same technology. So, we have to think creatively. How can we use the technology to, to make information free as it wants to be? But I mean, for your specific question, I mean, I think there are lots and lots of ways. I mean, I've just been talking about, how can we make knowledge from the global south kind of also accessible to everybody? But also, I think universities have a kind of important role in serving their local communities. And I think, that's long been a role of universities. And I think there are lots of different ways we can do that, working with local communities to create knowledge that's important for that community, whether it's, if you live next to an airport, whether it's about the noise or the air quality and how to kind of intervene in that. And sometimes you need to do that in local languages, but also, university libraries are incredible repositories of knowledge, and some of them still have books. Not all university libraries still have books. I don't know about Exeter. And making that available to local people, letting them in to kind of look at stuff and serendipitously find material. So, and again, I think the danger of the digital here is that we think, oh yeah, everything has to be digital, but how can we also make the knowledge that exists in all sorts of other forms available and useful to local communities, I think is a really important civic responsibility of universities.
And Carol, I wanted to pick up on your point about professionalization that was really implicit in some of your discussion about infrastructures and who does what kinds of work. What kind of opportunities do we have to re-envision even what counts as research, but also what counts as the right way to do research through more professionalization of certain kinds of roles?
Yeah, so I think for a long time we've been operating actually in a sense of team science, if you will, that there are multiple players when we're actually doing research. And I particularly come from the world of biosciences and biodiversity and so on, rather than philosophy and humanities. But this is a sort of recognition that it is a team enterprise. And that includes technicians, includes data specialists, includes informaticians. Bioinformaticians is a whole discipline, biostatistics is a whole discipline, but also software quality, software engineering, moving software from professorware, which means you just knocked it together to get the paper out, but no, it'll never work again, right the way through to actually it's reusable, right the way through to this is now used by a ton of people, and so we have to keep it up and keep it managed. And so I think that there's two big pieces there. The first is, how do we fund and sustain those kind of communities, those skills and those kinds of resources? And in a situation where we have funding based on individual projects, grants, and we're actually, what I've just described is pan project, and it's often pan organization, so that's tricky. And the second thing is we have to think about within, across the whole pipeline of getting, managing data, managing software, managing your results in science, you have to think about how am I going to resource all of that? And so an example of doing that at Manchester is that we have finally got an Office of Open Science, so there's a recognition that isn't just the responsibility of some, the European Bioinformatics Institute to do all of this. It's the responsibility of every organization. But we've also got, for example, data stewards, and we have a professional research software engineering team. So we have 40 on the books of the university full-time professional research software engineers. So that means that any PI in a grant can cost in, I need 6 months of somebody who's an expert who can take my dodgy algorithm and turn it into something that can be run on a supercomputer and will be able to run in my next project. But I don't have to hire somebody, a postdoc to do that. I'll just hire 6 months of a super expert. And that has the side effect of knowledge transfer across the university. So one of the big things about open science is the possibilities of collaboration and shared knowledge. And one of the side effects of that kind of thing is, because we've been running that for a few years at Manchester, is we have a fantastic cross knowledge. So we have projects now that were developed to do computational pipelining technology in biodiversity, and now been used in astronomy, not because the researchers said, oh, let's do a collaboration, because the research software engineers in the pool knew how to do it and said, we could just reuse that technique here and we could accelerate how you deliver that because we know how to do it and the infrastructure's free and the software's free. And all we have to do is to do a little bit of repurposing. So that's been a fantastic opportunity. I don't know if Exeter has a research software engineering pool. Does it? Does it? And how many, so you do that. So this is absolutely critical and essential, I think. So these are this is what's happened in the last 10 years, right? This is really important. So I think that's a great opportunity. And I would say that there are some risks, of course. One of the things that we have to do is to build trust with our researchers. And if you say to them, everything has to be open, that is quite scary. And like, you were an extreme opener, and even you think, ooh, because not everybody's ready to be open, and quite a lot of research can't be open. I also work in Health Data Research UK, which does trusted research environments using patient data that can't be open. There's often confidential data. There's also, you need to give people confidence that they can work with the infrastructures that you're giving them, the resources you're giving them in collaborations, and then open out. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for one might call enclave research, which is where you're working within your network, but then the expectation will be that you'll open out. And I think this is important in order to be able to gain the trust of researchers in this journey to open science. Otherwise, it's too scary to do. And then the last piece is you need to really ease the burden of open science, because it's actually quite hard to do. And we still haven't got time and space. I mean, PhD students are often the ones who end up with the burden, because they're the ones who are really, dare I say it, really doing the work. I speak as a professor, used to spend all their time on the plane, all I do is write grant proposals now and that kind of thing. But it's the postdocs, it's the PhD students, and they're often under enormous pressure, and early career researchers under enormous pressure. And so I also think it's the responsibility of the institutions to think about that pressure, to think about their careers, and to give them time to be able, and space, and incentive to be able to do open science. You can't expect them to do it in their spare time.
So in the name of opening out, I want to open out the floor for questions. What I'd like to do is spend maybe 20 minutes or so with questions from the audience. And we'll do a sort of wrap up. I'm warning the panel about some really pressing challenges that you see facing open science. And yeah, you'll have a few minutes to think about what those might look like and what some of the solutions might be. So over to the floor. Adam, you're up first.
Oh, okay, sorry. Is this thing on? Right, okay. Hi. Yeah, thanks very much. I wanted to pick up on something that you just said about open science sometimes being a bit scary as an experienced researcher. I guess the thought is that a lot of what we talk about with openness here has to do with information. So it has to do with published papers or data or something that you shared. And of course, that fits with what Helen was articulating, the norm of criticism of something that we can discuss. But of course, there's another way that's a long-standing way of thinking about science, which is something that's a craft, or it's an expertise, it's a know-how, it's a skill or something like that. And of course, in that case, even experts often aren't able to articulate what they're doing. I mean, it would be, and the whole idea of openness there doesn't seem to make much sense. If you've got an expert concert pianist playing, and of course you can't, it's sort of strange to say they're not being open about what they're doing. It's just that they themselves wouldn't be able to articulate. And the only way you can really make that more open is to pay more people to become concert pianists or something. So I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that, is there in an age where there's an assault on expertise as something, is that a worry about talk about openness, that there are just some things that are skills that we learn that we can't explain, that's part of the nature of expertise, and there's a sort of flip side to talk about openness which could seem like a challenge to that, but it's a perfectly legitimate part of lots of professional life.
Anybody want to take a crack? Sam, and then Carol.
I'll give it a go. I hesitate to delve into both social sciences and philosophy. I think there's a line here somewhere. We talk a lot about academic freedom and less about academic responsibility. I say there is a moral and normative position we should be taking in terms of the politics of this, which is that if we're engaged in a public activity, and I won't restrict it to just making the public funding argument, which I know is the traditional one. I think there's a bigger picture than that. We're engaged in a public activity in a platform which is supposed to be, again, for the public good, try and use that language, then we need to perform some form of legitimization of what we're doing. There is a boundary. It's the boundary that Carol's talking about. That you can spend a lot of time, and I did this, I've done this, spent a lot of time putting something online that no one ever looks at, no one has any interest in. But that fact, there's still reflexive value in that, in reflecting on your own expertise. And yeah, we'll gesture at Harry Collins' work, obviously, but yeah, that's a, and other people know that a lot better than I do, but I think there's a decreasing investment in the notion, which I subscribed to 15 years ago, that you can make everything available. That really just doesn't work. But you can be imaginative. So Collins' example of the experiment, which I can't quite remember, but where the story is that there was the distance between a particular attachment of a cable was really important, but wasn't ever recorded. I remember I asked Harry this question in a talk, but what if we had a video on the experiment? You would have seen that. And so I think that, and that's not, a point about cleverness, it's a point about maybe there are other ways to think about transmitting that information. Maybe that we can be open in thinking about how we transmit it, possibly not in a research paper, possibly not in the methods section, possibly in the software package, possibly in a video, possibly in a YouTube video targeted at primary care professionals. And so I think it's less about taking the position that we have to share everything and more about being reflective about how we can, with the limited resources we have, communicate as effectively as possible to the audiences we know about and the audiences we imagine might exist that we don't know about. And that, to me, the point about the extra work in sharing, even when it doesn't seem like anyone's going to use it, it's those audiences that we don't know about that I think are really important. And in the conversations we've had, I think that sort of, I used to frame that as a very one-directional, monodirectional kind of exercise, but there's also the opportunity to reach out and get those input from those audiences we don't know about, those collaborators we don't yet know about. So that would be my counter argument. It's not a counter argument on the principles, but it's a counter argument on the pragmatics, I guess.
Did you want to add something, Carol?
Yeah, I can add something. In my copious spare time, I'm also the digital lead of the research infrastructure for industrial biotechnology, like you do, and there's the real thing about protocols. So it's like standard operating procedures, and because although I often work in computational methods, nearly all these computational methods have a human in the loop at some point, which is like just how you use it, how you set them. And there are much of biology and certainly much of industrial biotechnology is to do with protocols, lab protocols. And this is one of the Cinderellas of the open science movement. So everybody's like, oh, share your software, which is inherently accurate because it's software, or oh, share your data. But what was the lab protocol? What was the protocol that you followed? And there are no standards. There's nothing. And I run a sharing platform for protocols. My goodness, getting that was blood on the carpet, because what that is special source. This is how our facility does it. And we don't want to reveal how our facility does it because your facility might copy that and we're unique. And if our facility offers that uniqueness, and that's why you've put us on the grant, or that's why you've come and hired us through a commercial activity. So it's really tricky. So we've had to develop a mixed world of exposed general protocols, so you're confident, but then to trust the facilities that their internal protocols are quality assured and could be accessed on demand. So it becomes a mix of on-demand and open, because otherwise you can't move forward. Everything will get stuck because of this, and perfectly legitimate fears. In the more molecular biology world that I live in Elixir, is a bit more open. But again, I would say standard protocols or protocol reporting is still bad. And if you read the papers, even if they're open access, the methods section is rubbish. And it's because of the journals of traditionally recent for the last 10, 15 years have said, oh, we don't really care about the methods section, it's boring. The methods section in each paper is like 250 words or something. And that means it's completely unreplicable. Well, there has been a backlash now that these methods have to be properly done, as it were. And I have colleagues at Manchester who are actually sort of text mining, re-engineering from papers what the methodology ought to be and should have been.
Oh, that's great.
So it's like kind of, this is methodology archaeology. It's, and somebody knew what the method was when they started. And can you be sure that you're right? Because in archaeology, if you dig up something, you always say it was a religious artifact, because that's everything's a religious artifact. So this can't be right. So I think you've put your finger on one of the great sort of gaps and as I said, Cinderella areas of open science and its method.
Yeah. So can I add two things that was so interesting? I think I've got a project right now looking at stem cell research and in particular how to make things more open. And the methods are just really plagued because they simply don't want to share those methods with each other. And there's some sort of notion of the high art being really what makes a difference. And even if they're using exactly the same cells, exactly the same cell lines, even if those have identifiers, which isn't also always the case, it's the methods that make a difference to taming it all. And you hear this among molecular geneticists and even to this day, even though the techniques are much more standardized. But the thing, going back to some historical research I did, is it also serves to exclude, right? So if you want to try to move into a field for whatever reason, or even move into a certain set of techniques even within your field, short of forming a personal relationship and going in person, it remains, there's no way to do it. So back in the day, that personal relationship was needed. You would think it wouldn't be now, but it's still very deeply needed because there is not this exchange of what maybe we might call tacit knowledge or performance, embodied performance or whatever else. And as you say, it's amazing what isn't in the paper. So having tried to do it, reverse engineering, we can't really actually figure it out. We can take a guess, but it could be, it's done in a very different way. And furthermore, in certain localities, depending on the field of science, there may be important differences depending on the resources available, depending on, what's in the air, if you're doing certain kinds of cultures, whatever else. And those differences might make all the difference to either lack of replication or ability to replicate and interpretation, right? So yeah, Adam, you hit a really big knot of things, I think. Ariana. Oh, I'm sorry. I've been trying to keep track, but I've lost track. Sorry, go ahead. Okay, if you do it, that's great. You go. So Charbel, it's on.
Okay, so I was touched by Cameron comments on we can do amazing things, but our leaders and the institutions we work are kind of constraints. And I was reminded by this provocative and controversial paper by Huffman and Rader in 2015, the Academic Manifesto, and they write that we have been taken over by management, and management's about accountability and calculating things, auditing things, being a lot suspicious about what we do. And then they say, well, in the end of the management has been much impervious to cogent arguments, so now we have to take action. So I'd like to ask the people on the table if you agree that there's a fight worth fighting, and in 8 years, if anything changed, and did we ever start to fight this fight if it's worth fighting it?
Oh, well, who wants to start? Cameron, you wanted a moment to talk about the lack of literacy in senior management, particularly about open science. This might be a good moment. I'm putting Sally on notice, though, that I'm expecting for various and sundry reasons. She'll have something to say about this too, as a senior manager who happens to be involved in these debates in the Netherlands.
So I guess let me start as an advocate, as an advocacy person. Sometimes you have to fight the fights. Otherwise, what's the point? But you have stolen my thing about what the challenge is.
You're gonna have to think of
I
another
gotta
one by the
be.
time we get there.
So I think there is a real challenge. So particularly in our country in Australia, we have a generation of institutional leadership, but it's not uniform by any means. There are honourable exceptions, but I have seen the same thing in various places in the UK, where people are focused on managing and controlling. I do think the way a social movement might change that, can learn from other social movements, can learn from the history of successful and unsuccessful social movements. But it's very clear that the acculturation of people into those roles has a very, very strong effect. And so I think there is a kind of break that would be needed to really shift things. I'm not sure what that break is. I will say we're working on a number of things that are hopefully going to be shocking enough or surprising enough that it will raise real questions about the presence and hierarchization of different universities, different countries. And that's my contribution, I guess, to trying to destabilize things enough that the people we know are well-intentioned and really good moving through leadership positions can perhaps have an opportunity to do that. We have opportunities when governments change to shift the conversations. We have an opportunity in Australia at the moment. The government has changed. It happens to be from right to left, but that's not even particularly relevant. It's just an opportunity to articulate a different vision. At the same time, I said this during the workshop, it's exhausting and people get burnt out. And I couldn't advocate to say that everyone has to take to the barricades and move things forward. But is it worth? Universities are very special institutions, in my view. They're both old and new. They have history and political and social capital. I think there's something there worth fighting for the kinds of societies that I think we're trying to envision. And they're potentially a platform for progressive change at the same time as they are deeply problematic institutions with very deeply problematic histories.
And I mean, in that way, open science is part of an overall research ecosystem, which has things like what we call league tables and other things deeply embedded in them. And so that's where we come back to the open science. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think part of what's coming out of this is that we're not really talking about, open science isn't this narrow specific thing. It's actually turned into both the history of all the things that have needed change for a long time and the opportunities that we haven't perhaps taken as much of that have arisen more recently.
Sally, did you want to add anything or leave it there? No, go.
No, there's things to be added. Always things to be added. And thank you for raising the academic manifesto. And I know both Willem Hofmann and Hans Rader extremely well. And we'll take this back, share this with them. I'm sure they'll be thrilled to know it's being read in Brazil. And I mean, I think the Netherlands, I mean, it's a tiny little country. And I was born and grew up in Canada, but I live now in the Netherlands. But I think in some ways it sort of punches above its weight in different respects. I mean, Dutch science policymakers always say this about how many papers we have and citations and things like that. But I think there are other important ways where it contributes. And certainly in recent years, I mean, I think there was also associated with the manifesto, what they called a Hapunt Nu, which was Reform Dutch Universities Now, which is a sort of weird play on Dutch and English. And there have been other sorts of initiatives. I mean, Sarah de Rijke and her colleagues have been involved in some of these, both called Science in Action, Science in Transition. But I think the unions play a role, but much less than they do in some other countries. And there have been some really important developments, I think, in the Netherlands. It's now much harder for universities to exploit precarious labor than it used to be. It's still possible, but they have to try a lot harder. There have been changes in the kind of labor contracts. CVTS, where Sarah, sitting here, for those of you who don't know her, the director, that group, and the Leiden Manifesto, the Declaration on Open Research Practices. So there are some real shifts. And this document that I'm kind of writing at the moment, you know, we used to have to, when we wrote these self-evaluations of research, you had to talk about metrics and all sorts of things, which we all knew weren't really appropriate for the kind of work that, you know, we do in my faculty. There's a new protocol. They still want evidence, but we have a lot more freedom to, you know, it's a bit like the narrative CV when applying for grants. There's kind of now a narrative collective CV for research evaluations. So I think these things do kind of make a difference. And I think, you know, we've talked a little bit about this over the last couple of days, and some of us kind of more often. You do have to pick your battles. You know, you can't reform everything immediately, but I think there are some signs of hope and change. And, you know, one of my tasks, I mean, I don't like to think of myself as senior management, but I guess probably people think I am. Yeah, sorry. Okay. You know, one of my main jobs is to try and protect my colleagues from even more senior management and their stupid ideas. Apology. I mean, actually, my senior management is great. But and I genuinely mean that. It's in case they're listening. They are very good, but that's not universal. But you know, sometimes still stupid things do come from on high, and sometimes, you know, from even further on high, from the ministry and their funding agencies. And you know, how do you maneuver that to try and protect your colleagues from these things? Yeah, is one of one's challenges.
Okay, in the last few minutes, I'm going to ask people to keep their questions brief and focused.
We
And
should
my
switch to
panelists,
online first.
even
though.
more so, please. Okay, I'm sorry, I can't quite see where the mic. Oh, sorry, photos, right or no?
Okay. We should let some people online who've been waiting.
Oh, sorry. Can you pan? Sorry. So Rose's going to read out some questions. Go.
Okay, so we have a question from Isabel Castanho. Castaño. Fantastic session. Much of the discussion has been around academic institutions, where I agree it should start. But I would like to ask the panel to comment on how this could be expanded to private institutions.
Sure.
Research in private companies has been growing quite a lot in recent years. How can we make sure that research in companies, where the goal is to make a profit, aligns with the open science movement?
Ooh, okay. There's a big challenge. Anybody want to take that up, Carol?
I can try. That's actually a very interesting question, because of course in the biosciences and biodiversity sciences where I work, there's a big industry and you can make a lot of money. And particularly SMEs, you know, they rely on open data in order to be able to operate their businesses. So you think that there'd be a sort of moral, is there an almost moral imperative for them to recontribute? Well, not really. They're open to their stakeholders, as it were. There are, however, areas in the drug industry and so on where there is pre-competitive sharing, because it just isn't. There isn't any competitive advantage, and if you collaborate and make things open, it is an advantage. So that does exist. It's a very interesting question from the point of view of the future of bioscience, because now we have a lot of AI. Most of the AI that's really strong in biosciences is operated out of business, and it's operated out of SMEs and Google, and big companies like that. And they've made their algorithms available, and in many cases, they made their data results available. I don't know how long that's going to continue, because it's early doors. So I think this is a very interesting issue. I'm going to say.
I mean, there's the old, we're talking about biology because it's what a lot of us have done work on, but the old thing that it's not about the data or the information, it's what you do with it and it's how you apply it, which is sort of, the distinction in patent law in lots of places, right? And so even back in the day, commercial genomics was open. I mean, there was this opening up that went on
Yeah.
because it wasn't the data, it was the interpretation of the data. That was really the key thing that was going to make a difference, both in commercial senses and in senses of making progress in the field, right?
Yeah,
There's an old
exactly.
tradition of saying commercial isn't necessarily in tension with openness.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I think we overlook that. This is where
Yeah.
history matters.
I think you're right. Absolutely. And the business enterprise couldn't exist without the availability of information and knowledge
Mm.
and know-how. So I think it's a bit more nuanced than just sort of it's closed and this is open. But I think it should be studied better.
Mm.
And I don't know about other areas.
And that is tricky. I mean, as
Yeah.
people who do science studies and so on, commercial companies much harder to get into and get a window into and be able to publish about.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But I think particularly the AI revolution gives us some pause for thought here.
Okay, next. Now it is
Try to
photos.
sum it up.
Yeah.
So a question that I've been struggling with is why is open science something different in terms of doing science? What is really the difference that it brings? And it seems like from all your experiences that you've shared, the collaborative aspect of open science is something very interesting. But through my first months of manic searching for my thesis, trying to figure out the origins of science and collaboration, it seems like if we take the use of the word, how the word collaboration in English, where it was brought up first, it was in playwright and science in the 18th century. So it's like it was very early.
Yeah.
It was right at the start of modern science. So this is not the new thing. But what is also very common that I've seen is the medium, the internet itself, and the aspect of the interfaces of the common public read aspect of the. So I'm wondering about the medium, like what does the medium itself play a role in?
So
in
is there
science?
anything new here? I mean, this is a typical thing we ask, right? And you bring up the medium, does it matter? And then the second thing would be the scale, right? If Sabina were here, she'd ask about scale, so I'll ask about scale. And in particular, is what's new a combination of our ability to have much broader scale in terms of geography and depth and everything because of the medium. So I think the two are kind of connected. Is this actually new, or are these norms that underlay science and we're just doing them more efficiently or in more trendy ways?
No, so I would say, particularly in my area, it's scale, because we've always had the ability to people have shared data in biosciences since there was biosciences done. However, it's now done like we're automating, so we're generating more data, and its availability, the online availability and accessibility, and being able to combine data and to combine tools and software. So I think that's radically scaled up the business. And I would say that we're still, the questions about should I share or not, these have, I was thinking about Mike Ashburner, who was one of the founders of, one of the directors of the European Bioinformatics Institute. And he used to say, if you're not sharing, you're not doing science.
I was thinking about that, yeah.
But he also said, scientists would rather, share their toothbrush than share their gene names. So, so there's always been this kind of tension. It's just become more, the scale of it, the opportunities of it have become, made it much, much more exposed, I think. And actually in biosciences, the pandemic was a turning point, because you really had to share. And the fact that the UK was amazing in that regard. We were one of the prime movers, and that's because we had infrastructure in place and we did share. There were plenty. I'm afraid Canada didn't.
Yeah.
Canada
But I think
was
that does point to the importance of sort of scientific cultures.
scientific
Sabine and I
cultures.
call them repertoires,
Yeah.
depending on the context. And Mike also would say, well, fruit flies are one thing, and then nematodes are another, and you have your
Yes.
different subcultures. And they wouldn't dream of not sharing in some of those subcultures.
Yeah.
And in others under certain conditions. And yet others, rodents and pharmaceutical, you're not going to share at all.
Yeah.
So I think it's very interesting to think about what the COVID moment did for, in a sense, coming to an agreed culture that had this kind of sharing at the center, right?
Although there's lots of evidence that it didn't persist.
And
that
I think that's
people
really
went
interesting
right
too.
back
Yeah.
to old ways. As soon as they,
Indeed.
as soon as they were off the leash, and then that raises issues of mandates.
Mm.
So in the end, what are the things that actually do people actually change their processes? Do they change what they're doing unless they're forced to change? People didn't adopt open access really in the UK until REF said it doesn't count unless it's open access. And then suddenly the university said, you will do open access. And that revolution, it did. It worked.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely,
and-
completely.
And we've
worked.
got something similar.
Yeah.
Except we don't have research assessment, but go on, Cameron.
I was a slightly different answer. The key here is the institutionalization. So that's the link. It's that how do you institutionalize the change that occurs in response to something? I'll give a bigger meta answer and say it's the scale which drove the medium. So two assertions. The scale of knowledge production has been increasing. The solar price, problematic statement in a number of ways.
Yep.
Knowledge production is a social process. Put those two things together and take them seriously, then we have a problem because social processes do not scale. You have to institutionalize forms, cultures, systems. And we've sort of sketched out a version of this, that there's a history of the 20th century you can draw where there's a series of institutionalization events that happen. Maxwell, Pergamon, industrialized journal production. Peer review has to be invented then to define a limit of what counts as scholarly. But then there's a problem of how do we interconnect this? And so Berners-Lee invents the web. So the web is a response to the scaling problem. The institutionalization is the adoption of the web. So then we've got this scale. So it's scale driving change that we have to respond to and find institutional structures that respond to it to allow us to continue scaling. Okay, that's continual growth model problems there as well. What I find interesting about that is that Maxwell Pergamon's an expansion. Peer review is a contraction. The web is an expansion. What's our contraction? And is it about trust and expertise and authority and what that looks like in a web-based world? And that's a weird thing for an open science advocate to be saying. But I think actually if we take seriously the notion of inclusive and social knowledge production, we need institutions that we haven't yet invented that are going to able to ascribe authority and trustworthiness, sorry, to use the appropriate term, in this context. And so it is the medium, it is the scale, and it's those things coming together.
So we need trustworthy institutions. That's a huge challenge. I'm going to get some summing up from everybody else because we're basically out of time. What do you see as the biggest challenge to what you think are the core values or the core processes associated with open science? So institutions are not made to fit. We got that one. Sally, what do you think? Biggest challenge and possible solution?
I mean, I think it's how do we harness the possibilities of digital technologies to support the public values of universities? And I think part of the answer is something, Carol's already been talking about is, how do we reduce our dependence on commercial tech companies? And I think part of that is, paying research software engineers decent salaries so they'll come and work in universities and do that kind of work. And, developing reward structures within universities that encourage people to share their data, make it accessible, that give them the time to do that. So, I originally studied economics. I think, it's partly a question of money.
Yeah. And who's going to pay and around what values, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Clearly. Helen, can I get you to go next? Biggest challenge to truly open science, whatever that might mean.
Well, I think one challenge to truly open science is questioning actually what science is good for. We think open science in some form is good for science, but what is this thing for which we want open science or various dimensions of open science? And I ask that because there are ways in which science is being pursued in universities, which are basically to serve some sorts of commercial and industrial interests. That is, the practical applicability of scientific research is stressed over and above theoretical advances. And this is part of the conversion of the university as a whole into a knowledge factory for industry and commerce. And as I think this is a challenge to open science, because what is it for? What is the purpose? What is the end goal that we want? I've been reading about the decline of the humanities in the university, the decline in the number of majors in humanities in American universities. And I've certainly seen it in the university to which I was most recently attached. Very few humanities PhD students, very few humanities undergrad. They're all going, well, then maybe they'll do the work that you're calling for. They're going to electrical engineering. But if we don't have a sense of the overall value of this, which I think does come from learning to think in the ways that we learn to think in the course of humanities, because the humanities history, philosophy, literature really encourage us to ask what for. And if we lose the ability to ask what for, then we're just working in service to goals that we don't understand.
So we need to reform the university and liberally educate everyone. Okay, Carol, what else do we need to do? Last challenge.
And world peace.
And world peace.
Biggest challenge, it isn't valued by anybody. That's the biggest, once it becomes valued, then we're on our way. And an expectation that is actually just a personal responsibility of the researcher rather than the collective responsibility of everybody involved in the enterprise, from the university to national infrastructures to global infrastructures to societies, scientific societies or research societies. I mean, there's this kind of mantra that it takes a village to raise a child, and this is the same. It takes a village to do open science, to raise open science and open research. So I think if you're going to, if you ghettoize it and just say, oh, that's a thing just a few people in the library will do, we're screwed.
Okay, will you join me in thanking our panel?